Good morning, my friends. It's great to be with you today. Yes, it's Tim, and starting Deuteronomy on our journey through the Bible. Our reading for today was in Deuteronomy chapter 1 and chapter 2. You know, toward the end of World War II in Europe, when Allied troops were marching through Germany, they arrived near Dachau for their first look at a German concentration camp. But it may surprise you to hear that instead of smashing the gate and liberating those inside, Eisenhower told his troops to wait for a day. And the reason for that? He wanted news reporters with their cameras to be there with our troops as they entered. He had a sense that it would not take long before some people would be saying, "This never happened." And unless someone was there to document all the death and destruction that they saw as they entered that camp, there would be those who would deny it ever happened, and the world would soon forget. I think that was prophetic because there are people who are doing that even today. Well, we all have short memories in a way when it comes to lessons learned. And as we get into Deuteronomy in chapter 1, Moses understood that. And I think that's why he began his last words with a review of what had taken place over the past 40 years and 11 months. He wanted those who were there to remember, and he wanted those in future generations to know how God had worked in their lives. But how interesting is it that in verse 7, we read that Moses said, "Turn you and take your journey and go into the mount of the Amorites and into all the high places, nigh thereunto, in the plain, in the hills, in the vale, and in the south, and by the seaside, to the land of the Canaanites, and unto Lebanon, and to the great river, the river Euphrates." Did he say Euphrates? He did. This was the Lord's promise, actually, back in Exodus chapter 23, verse 31. Well, where were the Israelites at this time? They were near the eastern banks of the Jordan River, and they were ready to cross over soon and enter the land God promised on the western side. And so, why is Moses talking about going to Lebanon and then to the Euphrates? Well, it's because God had a bigger picture in mind. When they crossed over and when they conquered the land of Canaan, that was just phase one of what God had in mind. Is what God promised Abraham in his covenant back in Genesis chapter 15 and verse 18. He said, "In the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, and saying, Unto thy seed have I given this land from the river of Egypt unto the great river, the river Euphrates." Take a map and look at that sometime. You'll see that is a huge chunk of real estate that God promised to the Jews, all the way from that slice of Egypt and a large part of Saudi Arabia and Jordan and Syria and Lebanon and Iraq up to the river Euphrates. Well, it was not a surprise to God that Abraham's descendants would go into exile in Babylon, as they did, or that they would return to the promised land, as they did, or that they would then be scattered around the world by the first century Romans, as they were, or that they would return once again, as we see Jews doing today. In fact, God said this is just what would happen in Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 4 and 5. He says, "If any of thine be driven out unto the uttermost parts of heaven, from thence will the Lord thy God gather thee, and from thence will he fetch thee. And the Lord thy God will bring thee into the land which thy fathers possessed, and thou shalt possess it, and he will do thee good and multiply thee above thy fathers." Now I realize for theologians in the early days of the Roman Catholic Church in the 4th and the 5th centuries, when they looked at Israel at that time, there was no Israel. It was just a desert wasteland with a few scattered tribes of nomads, and Jerusalem was depopulated. And it was beyond imagination that God could somehow keep the promises that he made to Abraham. And the result was the theology that must be God's finished with Israel, and that the promise of all of that land is somehow transferred spiritually to the church. Well, it's important to understand, though, that the foundation for premillennial theology is not found in Revelation chapter 20, but back in Genesis chapter 15. And the promises that were made by God have never been fulfilled in the past, which means that they will be fulfilled at some time in the future. And folks, we're seeing it happen today. As you hear the news reports about Israel and how they're fighting for their lives and defending their land, be aware of the fact that actually you're seeing God keep his promise they made back in Genesis 15 and in Exodus chapter 23 and in Deuteronomy chapter 1, right before your very eyes, it's happening. Well, give that some thought, my friends, and dig into God's Word, and we'll be looking at Deuteronomy chapter 3 and 4 tomorrow. Read it, and can't wait to share it with you then. Have a great day, everybody.